Well, like so many of you, I did in eighth grade. I did have braces, and yeah, that's what I looked like. It was it was rough, man. It was rough. Those like reels and TikToks are like, do you think this guy had a glow up or glow down? That's kind of what I see when I see that picture, because yeah, it was rough. But anyway, if you had braces and you've gotten your braces off, then you're pretty familiar with this thing as well, right? You know what this is. You've heard your mom talk about it quite a few times. It's called a retainer. If you don't know what this is, it's a retainer. This is what mine looks like, basically. This isn't mine, but that's what mine looks like. And you're so excited to get your braces off because you no longer look like this picture, and you now look like you have real teeth. And your teeth feel slimy, but you look so much better without braces than you do with braces. And so that day is such a great day. But then you get fitted for the retainer. And they tell you, specifically the first couple months specifically, your orthodontist will tell you that you have to wear it every day, like throughout the day, like whatever they say, like 21 hours of the day or some, I can't remember the exact number, but it was like basically if you're eating, take it off. If you're not eating, you got to have it in. And so you're wearing your retainer all the time throughout the day. And initially I had the bottom of my bottom teeth had the permanent retainer, and then they put it in wrong, where they basically crookeded my teeth, which I was like, that's so ridiculous. So anyway, I got the two, and I just kind of wanted an excuse to get my face off the screen. But I have two retainers. But you have two retainers. You now have two things to look after. You have two things to now remember. I will never forget one time at school, I had lunch, and I was in the period of time where I had to wear it throughout the day. And so I took off my retainer, I put it on my plate of food, I ate my lunch, then I threw my food away in the trash can. I made it home. I literally was doing my homework at home, and I was like, I don't have my retainer. And I remember literally I had to go back to school, and I went through the lunch table trash can, and I dug through the entire trash can. And you know what I found? I found my retainer. I washed it, of course, very thoroughly, but I will never forget, after that moment in time when I forgot my retainer on my plate of food and I threw it away, I'm never going to forget my retainer again. I'm going to make sure that I always know where it is. I'm going to make sure I put it directly in my mouth right after I eat my food. I'm not going to lose my retainer anymore, which has happened. I have not lost my retainer, but there is this thing about a retainer where you don't just have to remember where it is, you also have to remember to put it in, right? Have you heard your mom tell you this before? My mom still, from time to time, will bring it up. Are you wearing your retainer? And your mom has asked you that question before. My mom, she did it all the time for me. Did you wear your retainer? And it was constantly, did you remember? Did you remember? Don't forget. Oh, we went on a vacation. Make sure to bring your retainer. Don't forget to wear it every single night. And I don't know about you. When my mom would say, don't forget to wear your retainer, I would kind of always, not always, this sounds dramatic, like you kind of roll my eyes like, I know, Mom, I know, like I know that, I'll take care of it, yeah, I'll do it. And you get bogged down, reminder after reminder after reminder, but what is my mom trying to do? She's trying to do what? To protect me, right? Protect me from having to go through the braces situation again, to constantly remind me, hey, make sure you don't forget. Make sure that you remember to put it in and to wear it. I don't like reminders. You probably don't like reminders. But what we have in our text this morning is God basically telling the people of Israel, remember, 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 remember. And if you don't like reminders, then you might not like this sermon. But if you don't like reminders, I need you to see that this is a good thing for us to talk about reminders. It's a good thing for us to remember things, to not always learn something new, but to remember what we already know. I'd like you to open up to Joshua chapter 4. I entitled this sermon, Don't Forget to Remember. Joshua chapter 4, we're going to look at the whole chapter. But as you saw last week, the author, he kind of goes back and forth in terms of timeline. He doesn't really tell the story in a very linear fashion. He kind of says this, and then he goes back to it, and then he has a little flashback to what he said before, and then it just feels like it's out of order. And so I want to try to the best of our ability, read it in order-ish. So I'd like you to drop your eyes down to verse 10. We're going to start in verse 10. We'll get back up to verse 1. But we're going to see this morning the concept of the people of God, rather, need to constantly remind themselves, and reminders are a good thing. If you feel nagged by reminders, I want to convince you this morning that reminders shouldn't feel like a nag. They should feel, if it's something good and important, they should feel like a helpful tactic, a helpful safety net for you to do what you are called to do. And specifically, today, we're going to see this reminder to make sure that you remember God. It's one thing to forget your retainer, and you don't remember it, you get crooked teeth. But it's a bigger deal here. Forgetting God, not remembering God. So, pick it up in this story. It's still the same day, still the same situation of last week. We've got the people of Israel crossing the Jordan River. It's dried up. And so they're walking across it on dry land. The Ark of the Covenant is basically sitting there, held by the priests in the middle of the riverbed, and it's stopping the water from both sides. And now we have kind of the end of that river crossing right here in verse 10. Joshua chapter 4, look at verse 10. He says, "For the priests bearing the ark, they stood in the midst of the Jordan until everything was finished, that the Lord commanded Joshua to tell the people. According to all that Moses had commanded Joshua, the people passed over in haste. And when all the people had finished passing over, the ark of the Lord and the priests passed over before the people." So now they're getting out of the riverbed. And it says, "The sons of Reuben, the sons of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh also passed over before the people of Israel, as Moses had told them. About 40,000 ready for war passed over before the Lord for battle to the plains of Jericho. And on that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all of the people, and they stood in awe of him, just as they had stood in awe of Moses all the days of his life. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Command the priests bearing the ark of the testimony to come up out of the Jordan." So another flashback. Now we're coming out again. Verse 17, "So Joshua commanded the priests, come up out of the Jordan. And when the priests bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord came up from the midst of the Jordan, the soles of the priests' feet were lifted up on dry ground, and then the water of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed all of its banks as did before." So now we have the end of this crossing where they're done. They're walking out of the riverbed. It's stayed put. It's stayed dry. They've made it to their side. We talked about last week, 3 million Israelites. That's a lot of people. It says they passed over in haste. They all got across the river. And I want us, before we even talk about really Joshua chapter 4 and all that it tells us to do, I want us to not lose the shock and the wonder of this picture over my shoulder. The fact that God stopped a river with this box, and he told priests to stand in the middle of this river that was overflowing. This box stopped everything so that his people could be provided a dry passage with all of the grandmas and grandpas, with all of the young infants, with all of their cattle, with all of their stuff, to walk across this river into this promised land that we've talked about so much. I think when we read miracles like this in the Bible, we can grow so dull and insensitive to it. Yeah, cool, God did something. Yeah, I'm not really going to see that today, so I'm just going to, it's just a Bible story. It's just a Sunday school. It's just like a kid's ministry story. Where's the coloring book? Let's color it, and then we'll call it a day. I want you to not lose the wonder. God just did a miracle. And what he's doing here in Joshua chapter 4 is he's going to tell the people in a minute to remember what he did. But before we do, look at this story and be amazed by it. Take notice of what God has done. And for us today, thousands of years later, we're not watching God dry up a river and us walk across it, but we are watching God work in so many ways. And we have to be people that make sure that we look at what God is doing, notice it, and then be amazed by it. So point number one, we can write it down this way. Notice God and what he is doing. Point number one, notice God and what he is doing. Too often, we don't think about God as often as we ought to. Notice God and notice what he is doing. If you are going to remember God, if you are going to do what this sermon is going to tell us to do here in a minute, to remember what God has done, we have to at first take note and notice what he has done in the first place. And so verse 10, again, is just that summary reminder of what happened. The ark stood in the middle. Everyone crossed over on dry land. They passed over in haste. Verse 11, remember, they're following the ark of the Lord. This is God's symbolic presence in front of the people of Israel. And then we have these guys that we met back in chapter 1. You guys remember these people? The Reubenites, the Gadites, and the Manasseites. the tribe of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, where these guys were on the east side of the river. Remember this from Joshua chapter 1? You can write down verses 12 to 15, Joshua chapter 1, where these 2.5 tribes were told that they needed to go over with their brothers over the river, despite the fact that they didn't have land in the promised land. They had land on the eastern side of the Jordan. So what happens is the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the Manassites, they all cross the river. The men cross the river, and then remember what we said in chapter 1? They left their families behind. They left their women, they left their children behind, and all of these men, look back at the verse, it says they were all, 40,000 of them, were ready for war. They were armed before the people of Israel. They were not bringing all their stuff over because their home is on the other side, but they were following the people of Israel, or following with the people of Israel as one unit. We talked about in that sermon, the Help a Brother Out sermon, we talked about these 2.5 tribes caring more about the unit, caring more about the team than they did themselves, caring more about other people than they do their own desires, their own wants. And again, of course, they're obeying God. But what we see here is God opening up a river as the Reubenites, Gadites, and Manassites are being faithful to obeying God. God is being faithful to them as well in return. Do you see that? They're being faithful to God. God is being faithful to them by opening up this river for them to go across. The point is faithfulness to God. God will always be faithful to you in return. And so you wrote down for point of 1, notice God and what he is doing. What do I mean by that? Like I said, we oftentimes will just go throughout our weeks. We will just live our normal school week. You know, you're there, you just go through all your periods, you go to your homework, and you go to sports practice, or you go to your extracurricular practice, and you do your stuff, and you just kind of think of God when you read your Bible. Maybe if you read it in the morning or on your way to school, you think about him on Wednesday night for 2 hours, really more like the second hour from about 7:30 to 8:30, you think about God, and then you do on Sunday mornings. And God gets little sprinkles of your week, and he gets little sprinkles of your thought life. But this passage is getting us to think about God and noticing all of the things that God is doing. So we ought to obey God, right? We've talked about that at length. We have to obey God. But when we obey God, we need to make sure that, number one, he's the focus, but we're actually watching what he is doing in our life. How often do you actually do, point number 1, notice what God is doing? How often do you notice God? We need to be like the people of Israel here, watch God do something, and then look at him. Notice he's the one behind it. To be faithful with God and to watch what he does with it. How do we do that? Think about it this way, okay? So Karina will make dinner for the family, right? And let's just say she's been slaving away in the kitchen. She's been cooking some meals, and she makes this meal, and then we sit down for dinner as a family. And then let's just imagine, she stays in the kitchen after working that whole time, and she just, while we're eating, me, Ezra, Levi are eating, she just stays in the kitchen, and she just starts cleaning up before even having a meal. So, I mean, first of all, yeah, be real. Add me on, be real. But so she cooks it. What she should do after she finishes cooking it is leave the kitchen, right, and come sit down at the table. She's worked, she's been faithful, and now there's this moment in time where she should sit down with the family, and she should enjoy it with the rest of us. Now, often being a mom, sometimes you're tossed to and fro. You got a lot of stuff. You're doing a lot of things at one time. But it would be such a bummer to put in all of that work and then to not sit down and enjoy it. Kind of, you've heard the phrase before, stop and smell the roses. I mean, that's kind of biblical. It's kind of what we're talking about here, but even more so, where we are stopping to notice and enjoy. She should, when she's finished, look around at her 2 sons and her husband eating the food, who are enjoying the food, having a good meal together, and say, wow, I'm enjoying this moment right now after all of the work that I put in. The Reubenites, the Gadites, and the Manassites here, they were faithful to God, and now the point of them is to think and watch what God is doing. Think about it like this, okay? Some examples. You are called to evangelize. And let's just say you're going and you're being a faithful witness at your school. You're inviting your friends. You're asking them about the gospel. You're talking to them about the gospel. And you are faithful to God. What you should do is sit back and watch what God is doing. Take a moment to smell the roses and step back and say, what is God doing right here? I'm going to be faithful, but I'm also going to, this is not really a biblical word, well, it is a biblical word actually, to enjoy, to be excited about, to watch and to just sit back and say, man, this is so cool. To smell the roses, to notice what's happening, to take note of the fruit. You put in a lot of time and work into your schoolwork, into your homework. When you graduate, it's this moment to sit back and to say, wow, look at all that this work has paid off to be. Look, this is so cool. I'm going to enjoy this. That's why we have a graduation, to enjoy and to celebrate the work that has been done. You put your own selfish desires to death, and you submit to your parents day after day, and you obey them, and you honor them. You will be blessed with a good relationship with your parents, and what you should do is step back, smell the roses, and say, man, God, this is so cool. This relationship that you have given me with my parents, and enjoying the fruit, enjoying the meal, if you will, and say, wow, look at what God has done, to notice God and to what he is doing. Look back at the text. We have these people. God exalts Joshua and kind of calls him this new Moses here. Verse 15, Joshua then, Lord commands to Joshua to command the priest to come out of the river with the ark. Verse 17, Joshua commands the priest come out of the Jordan. And when the priests bearing the ark of the covenant, they came up from the midst of the Jordan. Look at this. The soles of the priest's feet were lifted up on dry ground, and then immediately the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed all of its banks as before. This flashback of the people of Israel crossing the Jordan. And look at verse 18. Look at the very specific detail. As soon as the soles of the feet, the bottom of their feet, as soon as they stepped on dry land again, on the banks, immediately the water comes right back to where it was before. Where this is God showing his power in his perfect timing, making everything, orchestrating it to the exact moment that he wants. What they should do is notice, wow, as water is rushing back, nipping at their heels to say, that was crazy. Look at what God just did. Clearly, God was waiting for me to get onto dry land, and as soon as it happened, the water comes back. Noticing God and his timing as well, the exact moment. Just think about the actual, literally the priests, as soon as they step onto the shore, what that must have been like to turn around and to look at everything come back, to say, wow, God made this happen. God did this. I'm going to notice that. I want us to notice the timing of God and notice how he orchestrates, like an orchestra conductor, or even a composer rather, how he orchestrates things to the exact moment in the exact time that he wants. If you guys were here back in these days, the first service that we ever did here in our church building, look at how plain it was. It was a crazy morning. If you don't remember that day, I'll tell you about it, because I do. That was the day that we had the Southern California hurricane. Do you guys remember that? Where everyone's like, Hurricane California. I don't even remember what the hurricane was called. But the day we should have been standing right out there under some easy ups in a literal hurricane. God made sure that was the first day that we got into the building. And guys, I will tell you, the amount of things that had to fall into place in the exact timeline, it was incredible to watch. It was so cool. Because that was Sunday. What's the day, the end of the work week? It's Friday, right? We did not have the permits to meet on Sunday, on Friday. We didn't have them. And by the end of the workday, we still did not have them. We still needed, I think it was like fire and something else. Let's just say fire. It's just a fire, where they have to sign off on this permit to say we can meet in the building. If not, it would be illegal for us to be here in the building. We would have had to stay outside in the hurricane. But what happened after hours, somehow, some way, the inspector that was coming to sign off on the permit, he knew Pastor Elliott, where I think his son and Trenton both played on the same basketball team, and so they knew each other, and he was like, oh yeah, I remember you. Okay, cool. You know what? I'll come after work. I'll come after I'm off that afternoon when I'm off the clock, and I'll come sign it off for you on Friday afternoon at like 4 or 5 p.m. or something like that, after the inspector literally was off. God made sure that Pastor Elliott had a son on the same basketball team as this guy. He made sure this guy was in the perfect place, getting off in the exact time that he got off, and made sure that he orchestrated every little detail for us to be in here. Is that a coincidence? Like, as you hear all of those details, do you think that's a coincidence? I don't think so. I think it's God in his exact timing orchestrating things to the exact detail and the exact timing that he wants. Just like as you look down in this text, as soon as they stepped onto dry land, water comes down. Not a couple days later, not a few hours later. It says the exact moment in time. They returned to their place, and look, they were overflowing again. We talked about that last week, that it was a flood time. You see, God is always right on time. He's always right on time. Think about that. Look at your life. God is always right on time. We'll talk about this here in a couple of months, I'm sure. Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2 is a story of what? Jesus being born. Do you guys remember how Luke chapter 2 starts? It says, Luke chapter 2, I'll just read it. But Luke chapter 2, it starts this way. He says this: in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all of the world should be registered. Where Joseph had to get on his feet, Mary's on the donkey, and he has to go register himself for some governmental census. First registration when Quirinius was the governor, and it says all went to be registered, each to his own town, his hometown, where his family was from. You know where Joseph lived? Not in Bethlehem. You know where his family was from? Bethlehem. And so God orchestrated this random census from the Roman government to take place at this exact time, and then all went to be registered. Joseph went from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And it says this, verse 6, and while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. The amount of trust that Joseph would have had to have at this moment in time to take his wife, or not wife at this point, fiance, that was pregnant by the Holy Spirit, at this point in time, when she's, 7, 8, 9 months pregnant, to just get on a donkey and go? Like, I've had 2 kids at this point in time. Around time of due date, like, everything is all focused on, you know what, I might have to leave. Just to let you know, like, if she starts, or water breaks, like, we're going to have to go to the hospital right now. And everything is so meticulously sensitive to the fact that there's a baby coming. Joseph and Mary got on a donkey and walked days and days and days up a giant mountain to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem here. God, in his perfect timing, orchestrated everything to line up the exact way that he wants. I want you to look at your life and look at how God is exactly timing up everything in your life. Think about it. You've transferred schools before. You've moved before. Looking back in time, do you think that God knew what he was doing? I'll tell you this. Every time you look back at your life, you're like, wow, God, he clearly knew what he was doing. And God gives us little glimpses to watch his timing time and time again throughout our lives. Obviously, Thanksgiving time forces us to think more about the details and the things that God is doing in our life, but Thanksgiving should be something that we're always doing. We're constantly looking for things, looking for ways that God is showing off his power and God is taking care of us. This isn't a perfect direct correlation, but Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2 says this. It says, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith. Again, the context, he's talking about examples and imitation. But just that concept of us as Christians, we're constantly looking to Jesus. We're constantly have God on the focus and attention of our minds. We don't notice God enough, and we ought to. And that's what the people of Israel, they were watching this miracle, and then we can get back to Joshua chapter 4 and look at what God tells them to do. So go back to Joshua chapter 4, and look at verse 1 here with me. What is the point? We talked about remembering your retainer. We know this is about remembering. Now what are we supposed to do about remembering? Look at this. Joshua chapter 4, verse 1 says this. It says, when all of the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, take 12 stones from here, out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you, and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight. And Joshua called 12 men from the people of Israel, whom he had appointed, a man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, pass on before the ark of the Lord your God in the midst of the Jordan. Take each of you a stone, put it on your shoulder, according to the number of tribes that were in the people of Israel, that this may be a sign to you. And when your children ask in times to come, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and when it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever. And the people of Israel did just as Joshua commanded, and took up 12 stones out of the midst of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, just as the Lord had told Joshua. And they carried them over to them, where the place where they had launched, and they laid them down there. And then Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests stood, bearing the ark of the covenant had stood. And there they are to this day. Summarizing what we just read here, God tells the people of Israel, 12 of the people of Israel, one from each tribe, grab a stone, put it on your shoulder from the middle of the riverbed, and we're going to bring those over to base camp on the other side, and we're going to set them up to make sure that you remember what these stones signify, that God delivered us out of this river. Where now we're talking about remembrance. And look at this here. Is this optional? Look back at it. Look, what word do you see? The word command, right? Are commands optional? No, commands are commanded, which means that they're not optional. So he's saying here that you must remember what God has done, which means you need to treat forgetfulness of me as a big deal. Point number 2, write down this way. Treat your forgetfulness of God as a big deal. Treat your forgetfulness of God as a big deal. God cares so much that the people of Israel do not forget him, that he wants them to create a little stone pile, a little 12-stone memorial that God has delivered the people of Israel. Again, these are big rocks. Look at what it says. Put them on your shoulders. Like, it's not just like carried in my hand. Like, these are big rocks that you're going to put on your shoulder, and you're going to bring it to camp, and we're going to set a memorial up. You're going to stack some stones up together and remember what God has done as a reminder. I want you to think about like the nostalgic nature of these stones here. These stones used to be underwater, right? They were underwater in the Jordan every day. And now God has dried it up, and he gave them 12 stones. And these are just total ordinary stones that now, because of what God has done in that riverbed, now become very, very special. Regular old stones now become nostalgically special. I'm sure we don't have any Oakland A's fans in the room right now, but the Oakland A's are a baseball team, and they've been in Oakland for I think 57 years. And this year they're officially leaving the city of Oakland. And what happened? It was earlier this week, where after the game there was this big celebration of this baseball team in Oakland. And then what all of the players did is they all went out to the baseball field, and they all started digging some dirt out of the pitcher's mound, out of the infield. They started taking grass, and they filled up their cups, these Oakland A's players, to say, man, I've got some dirt. And this dirt, as I look at this dirt, is going to remind me of my time on this team, because they're not coming back there. The team is not going to be there. They're going to be in Sacramento next year, and then they might be in Las Vegas the next year after that or something like that. But they're never coming back. And so the last game, to memorialize it, we're just going to get some plain old dirt off of the pitcher's mound and out of the infield. Regular dirt now officially becomes special. If you want to go buy this dirt, I'm sure you could probably buy it. I'm sure it's probably expensive, right? Because it was common, but now it's not common anymore. Now it's special because of where it was and because of the nostalgic nature of it. And think about this. This guy right here, I don't know who this guy is. He's going to have a cup of dirt in his house for the rest of his life. Cup of dirt, okay? And he's going to have kids, and he's going to have grandkids, and they're going to be like, hey, Grandpa, why do you have a cup of dirt on your mantle? Like, why do you have a cup of dirt in your room right now? Why are you displaying dirt? And he can say, you know what? Let me tell you about it. This dirt is not just plain old dirt. This is special dirt because of the memories that this dirt now signifies. This symbolic nature of this is now special. That's what God is telling the people of Israel to do with some rocks. What Moses did is he set up basically a pile of rocks looked like this, where he just, at camp, again, how big these were, we don't really know, and we didn't really find these 12 rocks or whatever in Gilgal where he was. But these rocks are now a teaching tool for Grandpa to tell his grandkids, for Mom to tell her daughter, for Dad to teach his son, and to say, guys, it's just plain old dirt. It's just plain old rocks. But what it symbolizes is something so much more special than that. It's a big deal. Look, let me tell you about this. Sit down on my feet. Let me tell you the story of how God delivered us. God doesn't want his people to forget. Last week we talked about God saying, watch this. Now he's saying this week, he's saying, remember this. Watch this and remember this. Watch what I'm doing and then don't forget about it. Make sure that you mill it over in your mind, thinking about it. And I know what some of you are sitting here thinking right now. Okay, I just don't have a good memory, so I'll try to apply this sermon. I'll try to do it. But like, you've never met me. Like, how often I forget my homework, how often I forget my phone, actually, no, I don't ever forget my phone. How often I forget my, backpack or whatever, like school stuff. I forget stuff all the time. I don't know if I can do this. Other people in this room, they got better memories than me. I watched them rattle off the verses at revival, and it seemed to be much easier for them. They remember stuff better. God knows people are forgetful. Do you know why this story is taking place? Because God knows the people of Israel are very forgetful people, just like you. You are forgetful. I am forgetful. That's not an excuse to sit back in our forgetfulness and say, you know what, I don't know if I'm going to remember. This pile of rocks is you getting to think about God, is getting you to not forget about God. God inflicts punishment on those people who do forget. Look at this, Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 11 to 14 says this. He says to the people of Israel, take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I've commanded you today, lest when you've eaten, you're full, and you've built your good houses to live in, when your herds and flocks multiply, and your silver and gold shall be multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart will be lifted up, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Deuteronomy happened before Joshua. And Deuteronomy is looking forward to Joshua's time and after Joshua's time to say, don't forget about God. When life gets good, and here's the thing, for some of you right now, life is pretty good. Life is pretty easy. And you know what? That's when it is most tempting to not think about God, because you're just going through your week. I just mentioned it before. You might not think about God, but Sunday mornings and Wednesday nights. If that's the case, heed this warning right here where God says, don't forget about me when things go well. Look at verse 18 to 20. Then he inflicts this kind of punch in the face to say, and if you forget the Lord your God and go after other gods and serve them and worship them, I solemnly warn you today that you shall surely perish. And the nations that the Lord makes perish before you, so you shall perish, because you would not obey the voice of the Lord your God. What does this say here? This says you forget God, you die. It sounds like a pretty big threat right there. Forget God and die. God cares about forgetfulness. He doesn't want you to forget him. And that's part of the reason why he's commanding the people of Israel in this story to stack some stones up and remember. Turn over to Psalm 103. Psalm chapter 103. I want you to see this. Maybe for some of you, you've read this verse before, but I want you to read it with new context, with new eyes, with a new frame of reference. That remembering and not forgetting is a spiritual discipline that everyone in this room needs to get better at. myself included, your leaders included, we all need to get better at remembering God. Listen to what David says in Psalm 103. He talks to himself and he tells himself, hey, buddy, don't forget about God. Psalm 103. He says, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. What he's saying here is, worship God, David. Worship him. Everything that's in you. Worship, bless his holy name. Verse 2. Bless the Lord, O my soul. David, make sure that you worship God. Listen to this. And forget not all his benefits. Why does he say that? Because it's really easy to forget. Verses 3 through 5 explains what his benefits are. Listen to this. He forgives your iniquity. He heals all of your diseases. He redeems your life from the pit. He crowns you with steadfast love and mercy, who satisfies you with good so that your youth is renewed like the eagles. Hey, David, don't forget about all of the benefits of God. Remember them. And you know what? Before you forget, worship him for it. Bless the Lord for it. Everyone in this room needs to take David's example here and do the exact same thing. Hey, don't forget. Hey, don't forget. Hey, don't forget. Think about what he's done. Forgiving, healing, redeeming, crowning, satisfying. Listen to what God has done. Look at what God has done in your life and make sure that you don't forget. How do I stop forgetting? I'm a forgetful person. How do I stop doing it? Look back at the text. He says, set up a reminder for it. Look at this, back in Joshua chapter 4. Joshua chapter 4. Again, we've seen it a couple of times in Joshua. It sounds like he says the same story twice because he'll explain what he's going to do, and he says, go do all of these details, and then he explains when they do all of the details, and then the exact details that he already explained. So this is going to sound redundant, but I want you to look at verse 19. Joshua chapter 4, verse 19. How do I stop forgetting? Thinking about God means I need to set something up to remind myself of him. Look at this, verse 19. People came up out of the Jordan. On the 10th day of the first month, they encamped at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua, he set up at Gilgal. And he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know that Israel passed over the Jordan on dry ground, for the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, and he dried up for us until we passed over, so that all of the people of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, and that you may fear the Lord your God forever. What he does here for the people of Israel, as he says, I am going to tell you to set up a remember God plan. Point number 3, write it down this way. Create a remember God plan. Quote unquote, a remember God plan. These stones are a don't forget, and it's also a remember. Right? Don't forget and remember, we're kind of saying the same thing. One side of the coin, the other side of the coin. If you are a forgetful person, I forget stuff all the time too. Create a remember God plan. The thing is, the only reason that we have this story of these rocks is because God knows that they're forgetful people. And so look at verse 19. He says, when they came up out of the Jordan, listen, this is the first time we see a date take place in Joshua. He says, on the 10th day of the first month. That probably doesn't mean much to you, but the 10th day of the first month, so again, we'll just call it, it's not actually January 10th, but just picture, okay, January 10th, it's actually the months of Nisan, which I think is I believe it's in the fall. But anyway, we got come up out of the Jordan on January 10th. What happened on that day? What happened on the first day, or the 10th day of the first month? 40 years earlier, the 10th day of the first month, January 10th, quote unquote, was the day that the people of Israel in Egypt had to get their Passover lamb. So basically what he's doing here is he's on this exact day when this whole Exodus started. On that day, he's bringing them into the land on that 40th anniversary of that day. When the people of Israel, they wandered around the wilderness for how many years? 40 years, to the exact day, the 10th month, or the 10th day of the first month. And what he's doing by bringing his people into the land on that exact anniversary date is getting them to remember what he has done in the past. And so subpoint A, write down this way: recount God things from history. Recount God things from history. What he's doing is he's reminding them of a past date, of a past anniversary. Recounting God things. What do I mean by God things? God flexing his power, God being faithful to you, what God does to remember those things from history. The Passover had started 40 years ago. This was clearly a reminder to them. This day is important. One of the commentators I read said it this way. I thought it was just so well put. He says, this day marked the beginning of redemption, and now it has marked its completion. Where God started to redeem his people on that day, and he's finishing the job on that day by ushering them into the promised land. It's a God anniversary. Anytime you have an anniversary is you looking backwards at what has happened in the past on that day, but then also looking forwards as well. Right? And so I don't know if June 3rd means anything to you. It does mean something to me because on June 3rd of 2018, that was the day of my wedding anniversary. That was the day me and Karina got married. I went in my camera roll. I took this screenshot on that morning because I was like, Apple Calendar. And so I have the screenshot. You don't think it's cool. I think it's cool. But anyway, that morning, I took this screenshot of this calendar because I knew that day my life was going to be in two halves. The day, every day from June 2nd, 2018, backwards, and then June 3rd to the end of my life. And that was very different. And so every June 3rd is a time where we look backwards to what happened on that day, but also we look forwards as well. So every June 3rd is special in our house. We'll do something. We'll have a meal together. We'll go on a date together. We'll go get coffee together. And the first year we had that cake. I don't know if you know this, but you're supposed to keep the top level of your wedding cake. And so we had, it actually wasn't the real cake. They made another one for us, a cake topper. And we ate it on June 3rd of 2019, on our 1-year anniversary, where what you're doing by eating that cake is you're remembering the past year. And so we go on a date, we'll go on a nice dinner, and so I just compiled, I went June 3rd in my camera roll, coffees, dates, and stuff like that. What we do on June 3rd is we look backwards. Hey, all of those years ago was the day that we got married. We're looking back in time. But what we do every time we go on a date is we're talking together also about the future and being reminded we made a covenant and a promise to each other in the past. We're also remembering this date so that we can look forward as well to the future as well. An anniversary causes you to look back and causes you to look forward. So what God does by bringing them in on the 10th of Nisan is to make this connection, to remember. Look down at verse 23. He also brings up another history thing. Remember that God has allowed you to cross the Jordan, but also, look at this, the Red Sea as well. We talked about that last week. The people of Israel walked through a dry riverbed in Jordan and walked through a dry Red Sea, and they walked across it. And it's a reminder of what God has done in the past, recounting God things from history. You can write down Psalm 105, verses 5 and 6. Psalm 105, verses 5 and 6 says, remember the wondrous works that he has done, his miracles, and his judgments he uttered. O offsprings of Abraham, his servants, children of Jacob, his chosen ones. What he's saying here is, people of God, make sure you look back in time, in history, both in the Bible and then also in your life as well. It's a purposeful decision to remember God things from history. We've been talking about this concept of never forgetting. You see those words on the screen, never forget? What does that make you think of? Never forget, those two words together, when you see it like that. It's also in navy blue and white. Never forget is something that we say as Americans every September 11th, right? You see those on Instagram, you see those stories. Never forget is to say, I'm not going to forget about what happened on 9/11. I'm going to look back in time. And also, I'm going to memorialize, I'm going to remember those people that died. I'm going to remember those firefighters that went up the stairs as everyone went down the stairs. I'm going to remember what it's like to be an American. And there's this somber reflection of the past. Why that phrase? Because it's easy to forget. Because we focus all of our attention on what's next. We often don't think about what has happened in the past. And frankly, do you care more about remembering things in American history remembering things that happened in your history books more than you remember the things of God? Like genuinely, if you care more about 9/11 than you care about histories and things that God has done in your past, then frankly, you need to switch your priorities to never forget the things of God, those being the most important thing in your life. We're reminded twice a year, in December and then sometime in April or March, Christmas and Easter. Those two things I can ask everyone in this room, what is Christmas all about? What is Easter all about? And everyone in this room can tell me. Christmas is Jesus was born. Easter is when Jesus rose again. And then a couple days before that, he died. You can remember those two things. Where every Christmas time, we're talking about Jesus being born. And every Easter morning, we're talking about an empty tomb. What are those? Reminders. Hey, don't forget. Don't forget. Don't forget this important day to make sure that you thank him for coming down to planet Earth. Make sure that you thank him for rising again. We also have opportunities to do that throughout the year as well. We just did it actually this morning, if you're in main service, called the Lord's Supper. Lord's Supper is this, when you take grape juice and bread, and you drink those two things, looking back in time at what God has done. Listen to this. 1 Corinthians 11, 23 and 26. He says, "For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus on the night which he was betrayed, he took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he said this is my body which is for you. Do this in what? Remembrance of me." And then he goes on. In the same way, he took the cup after supper, and he said, "This cup is a new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink of it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." I want us to be more intentional about thinking about past things and what God has done, both in Scripture, but also your life. And also the life of the church as well. Where we're thinking about dates, we're thinking about anniversaries, and we're looking back, we're thanking God for it. I got 3 dates on the screen, the 3 important dates here in our church's history. The first one, I'll be honest, that's one that I do know. These other ones, I did have to frankly look up. The 18th of September, that's our birthday, when our church started. But if you also remember that it was kind of a big deal when we could get the permit for this building, that was on August 22nd of 2022. And then literally a year later, almost 2 days, little under a year, was our first Sunday in the building. And frankly, I had to go through my camera roll to figure out those 2 dates. And honestly, I was convicted by that. I really was. And I'm going to remember those 2 dates now. August 22nd and August 20th. And then don't forget September 18th. To remember, when these dates roll around, like a birthday, like an anniversary, God, look at what you've done. Look at how faithful you've been to us. I want to make sure that I never, ever, ever forget that. And I'm going to cause that to make me worship you. And these stones right here in verse 20, they set these stones up in camp at Gilgal, which is the campsite that they were at, as a reminder. And so a physical, visible reminder of God. Subpoint B, right down this way, set up God reminders as well. Things in your life that cause you to focus your attention on something, to get you to think back to who God is and what he's done. Tangible, visible reminders, God reminders. Where they walk by and they see, the stones stacked up on top of each other. They're like, oh yeah, that's right. Remember that? Remember that? Remember what God did? That's so cool. Let's worship him. It's a pile of rocks. How common is just a pile of rocks that cause them to think about God, cause them to remember God? For you, it might be artwork in your house. It might be something at your desk that reminds you to work hard. It might be a verse that you maybe put on your phone as a wallpaper for your phone, where you're getting stuff in your mind to remind yourself of God. I remember, I'm not like advocating for this. If you want to, you can. I'm sure it's not, whatever. I'm just going to say it. Back in school, I remember doing this. I would write on my hand, I would write an E, Y-E. It was an E to remind me to evangelize. And so I'd be in school. Actually, I think I put it on my right hand. so that I would be writing in class and I would constantly see this reminder, evangelize. Oh, look for opportunities. Look for people that I can talk to about the gospel. Write on your hand, get the lead poisoning in your blood or system or whatever. I don't know. But like, get some reminders in your life, in your school, on your phone, on your laptop, at your desk to remind you of God, just like a pile of rocks. Maybe you do go grab a pile of rocks and you put it in your backyard or something like that. Oh yeah, those rocks, that reminds me of Joshua chapter 4. Oh yeah, that reminds me of God. Set up tangible reminders as you look backwards and also look forwards. Remembering God should prompt you to obey him. Remembering these things should prompt you to, in the future, continually obey him. It's kind of like in my office. I've got my diplomas hanging up in my office. This is my view from my desk, where I've got them hanging up over on my, as I'm sitting there, over on my left side. And every time I see those pieces of paper, because that's what they are, just pieces of paper, on the wall, it's a reminder of the significance of those pieces of paper. Those were, hard-earned pieces of paper. They're expensive pieces of paper. But what they do when I see them on the wall is remind myself, oh, I look back at what I did in school, but you know what? That's going to make me work hard right now. Look at everything that's been invested in me back then. I'm going to make sure that I work hard on this sermon. I'm going to make sure that I counsel this person well and go to the Bible. A reminder on my wall causes me to do something in the future. That's what God reminders get us to do. They prompt us to be faithful to him. And then lastly, we see here, the people of Israel, verse 21, are told to talk about it as well. Subpoint C, write down this way, talk about God things with others. The point here is for parents to teach their kids. You don't have kids, so who are you going to teach? Your future kids, but you're going to talk about these God things with other people. Hey, remember that sermon. Hey, remember good teaching moments to remember what God has done. Reminding yourself and helping other people remember as well. And again, none of us are above reminders. We all need reminders. Really, this sermon is one big reminder. I don't know that you learned anything new in this sermon. Maybe you did. If so, well, hopefully you did. Yeah, hopefully you did. Learn some new things. But if you didn't, okay, it's a reminder. What's the point of a reminder? To get you to keep going, to get you to not forget. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 12 and 15 says this. He says, therefore, I intend always to remind you of these qualities. I'm going to constantly remind you, Peter says, though you know them, you know these things already and are established in the truth that you have. I think it right, as long as I am in this body, to stir you up by way of reminder. Since I know that the putting off of my body will be soon, I'm going to die soon, as the Lord Jesus Christ made clear to me, and I will make every effort that after my departure, you may be able to at any time recall these things. What Peter is doing is saying, hey guys, don't forget, don't forget, don't forget. What I do every Sunday is I come up here and I say, hey guys, don't forget, don't forget, don't forget, don't forget, don't forget. No one in this room is above reminders. We all need them. And sometimes, frankly, there will be sermons that I preach that for some of you in this room that have been at church your whole life, you're like, yeah, I already know that. I know that already. That happens. That happens. But that's not a time for you to check out and say, I don't need that reminder. I don't need that. That's fine. All of us do. I do. You know where I am at the 9 o'clock service? In there, learning new things, being reminded of old things. And you know what? Though I went to school, though I went to seminary, though I got a master's degree in the Bible, some of these things, yeah, I already know. Oh, yeah, that cross-reference. Oh, yeah, I know that one. But it's a reminder. Oh, yeah, don't forget. Think about God. Church is not just about learning new things. It's constantly about reminding yourself of old things. And that's what the people of Israel are doing to each other. Listen to this, verse 24. So that all of the people of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, and that you may fear him, your God, fear the Lord your God forever. The point is that we sit back and we worship God. We obey God, who he is, what he's done, so that we might fear and obey him. I hope that this reminder, this big, long reminder, one of the longest reminders you've ever heard, to remember God, causes you to fear him, causes you to obey him, and causes you this week to go, not forget, but remember God, who he is, how he's provided for you, and how you can obey him this week. So let's bow our heads and pray right now. God, we do thank you this morning for this reminder, God, from a story A whole sermon about a pile of rocks. God, a pile of rocks is something that we need in our lives, God. We need lots of piles of rocks to remember what you have done. God, we are forgetful people. We confess this morning that we forget you too often. We don't do what you've called us to do. We forget to obey you. We forget to that sermon or that small group, the goals that we made. God, I pray that you would forgive us of our forgetfulness and that this week we would be more, that we would remember more and that we would do so with you in mind. We would do so looking for how you have been faithful to us, that we can go out and obey you and fear you this week. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.